I hope HES okay. Flushed face happened today at Horse Guards. The sky was clear, with just a few clouds drifting lazily above, and the sun had begun to bathe the historic buildings in golden light. Tourists and locals gathered along the barriers, eagerly awaiting the famous changing of the guard ceremony, a tradition that had taken place for centuries. The sound of marching boots on the cobblestones filled the air, creating a rhythmic beat that was both calming and exciting. Among the crowd stood a young man, dressed in casual clothes, a camera slung over his shoulder, ready to capture every moment of this historic spectacle. His eyes moved from the majestic guards in their bright red uniforms, standing perfectly still as if frozen in time, to the polished horses that stood next to them, their coats gleaming in the morning sunlight. Everything seemed so meticulously in place, so perfectly organized. It was almost as if nothing could go wrong. But the young man wasn't just here to watch. He had been coming to the Horse Guards parade for years, ever since he moved to London. He had grown fond of the ceremony, the pageantry, and the silent power that seemed to radiate from the guards and their magnificent horses. Today, though, something felt a little different, though he couldn't quite place why. Maybe it was the unusual chill in the air, or the way the horses stood so still, their eyes scanning the crowd. Or maybe it was the way the wind picked up just as the guards began their synchronized march, whispering secrets to the leaves of the trees lining the parade ground. Despite the stirring feeling of something out of place, he pushed it aside, focusing on the ceremony ahead. The guards moved in perfect unison, their polished boots clicking in harmony, their swords gleaming with every step. The horses beside them were equally impressive, their muscles rippling under their shiny coats. Each horse was a picture of strength, and the young man couldn't help but admire the bond between the riders and their steeds. They had been through countless drills together, their movements as natural as breathing. The air felt thick with the weight of history. For a moment, the young man felt like he was a part of something greater, as though the centuries of tradition were wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. He raised his camera, snapping photos of the guards, the horses, the crowd, capturing these moments in time. Each click of the shutter brought a sense of satisfaction, as though he were preserving something sacred. Then, as the guards moved past him, something caught his attention. It was a horse, one of the steeds near the front. It was shifting its weight nervously, its hooves scraping slightly against the cobblestone. The young man furrowed his brow, wondering what had caused the horse to react this way. He'd watched these horses many times before, and they had always seemed so calm, so steady, never once showing any sign of unease. But this one seemed different. He continued watching, feeling a slight unease tugging at the back of his mind. The horse's ears were flicking back and forth, its muscles tense. The young man could almost feel the energy in the air change. It was as if the horse knew something was wrong, though it couldn't yet express it. And yet, despite the horse's evident discomfort, the rider, sitting tall in the saddle, didn't seem to notice. Or if they did, they chose to ignore it. They remained perfectly still, their face impassive, focused on the task at hand. The young man shifted his weight, instinctively taking a step back, unsure if he was reading too much into the situation. It was probably nothing. Horses, like people, had their moments of agitation. It could be something as simple as a gust of wind or a distant sound that only the horse could hear. He told himself not to worry. After all, this was the Horse Guards parade. These guards were some of the most disciplined, most skilled soldiers in the world. Their horses were well trained, and this ceremony had gone off without a hitch for as long as anyone could remember. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. His eyes remained fixed on the horse, watching as it continued to shift its weight, its muscles twitching under the stress. The young man's heartbeat quickened slightly, his instinct telling him that he should be paying more attention. There was something about the way the horse moved that was off, something unsettling. The parade continued around him, but the young man couldn't pull his gaze away from the troubled animal. He looked at the other horses in line. Most of them seemed unaffected, calm and collected, as if they had been standing still for hours instead of just a few minutes. But this horse, it was different. The young man found himself holding his breath, waiting for something to happen, something that would put his mind at ease. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, and the sound of the guards' boots marching on the cobblestones grew louder in his ears. The other spectators around him chatted quietly, some snapping their own photos, others simply enjoying the ceremony, completely oblivious to the unease he was feeling. He almost wished he could shake off the sense of impending danger, but it was like an invisible weight pressing down on him. As if on cue, the horse gave a sudden, sharp movement. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but the young man saw it clearly. The horse's head jerked, its body tensed in a way that wasn't natural for such a trained animal. And then, in the blink of an eye, the horse reared up on its hind legs. The young man's heart stopped in his chest. Everything happened in an instant. The rider tried to regain control, but the horse was frantic now, its hooves pounding the air as it bucked wildly. The young man's breath caught in his throat, his camera forgotten as he watched the chaos unfold before him. The crowd gasped, some taking steps back in fear, others screaming for help. The rider's grip slipped, and in a blur of motion the horse lurched forward, throwing the rider to the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The young man's legs felt like they were made of stone, his body frozen in place as he watched the rider lie motionless on the cobblestones. The horse, still rearing, was quickly subdued by the other guards, but all the young man could think about was the rider, lying there, too still, too quiet. The air around him seemed to hold its breath. People were already rushing forward, the sound of hurried footsteps filling the space. The young man was paralyzed with shock, his mind racing. Had the rider been hurt? Was he okay? He could barely focus as the scene before him unfolded. Medical personnel appeared from nowhere, their faces grim as they knelt beside the fallen rider. The young man couldn't tear his eyes away, his thoughts swirling. "I hope he's okay," he whispered under his breath, the words barely audible over the growing panic around him. The horse guards parade, once filled with the sounds of marching feet and the beauty of tradition, had turned into a scene of chaos. The young man stood there, rooted to the spot, wondering if things would ever be the same again. The chaos in the horse guards parade was overwhelming. The young man stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, watching as medical personnel rushed to the fallen rider. The once orderly ceremony had descended into a frenzy, and the crowd had started to murmur, their voices rising in worried whispers. Some tourists looked around, unsure of what was happening, while others were pulling out their phones, snapping photos of the scene, perhaps thinking it was all part of the show. But the young man knew this was anything but a performance. His eyes were fixed on the rider, who lay motionless on the cold cobblestone ground. The once dignified ceremony had now become a blur of movement, with guards shouting orders to control the horses, while others tried to clear the area. The horse that had caused the accident had finally been calmed, but its rider was still on the ground, and it was clear that the situation was serious. The young man's mind raced. "Is he okay?" he asked himself repeatedly, but the question didn't seem to make sense. How could he know? How could anyone? There was nothing in his training or his experience that could prepare him for a moment like this. He wasn't a paramedic, and he wasn't one of the guards who could rush to help. All he could do was watch, helpless, as the scene unfolded before him. A few feet away, a group of tourists were talking in hushed tones, some speculating about what had happened. "I think the horse got spooked," one of them said, her voice shaky. "Maybe it was something in the crowd," another person nodded, adding, Horses are sensitive, you know. They can sense everything. Maybe there was a sound or someone got too close. But none of this made sense to the young man. He had watched the ceremony countless times before, and he had never seen anything like this. The horses had always seemed calm, collected, in perfect harmony with their riders. But this time, something had gone terribly wrong. The sound of hurried footsteps filled the air as more medical staff arrived on the scene. They knelt beside the rider, checking for signs of consciousness, quickly assessing the situation. The young man could see the worried looks on their faces. The rider wasn't moving. The young man's stomach tightened. He had to look away for a moment, feeling a wave of nausea wash over him. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stand seeing the rider lying there so still. It made the entire scene feel unreal. The medical staff began to move the rider carefully, placing him on a stretcher. The crowd parted to make way for the stretcher, but the young man barely noticed. His eyes were still fixed on the rider's face, or what he could see of it. The rider's helmet had been removed, and the young man could see that his face was pale, his eyes closed, his body completely still. He couldn't tell if the rider was unconscious or if something worse had happened. All he could do was hope that the rider would wake up, hope that it wasn't too serious. But as the stretcher was carried away, the young man couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just occurred. There was something about the way the rider had fallen, the way he had been thrown from the horse, that made it seem like more than just an accident. Was it a freak occurrence, or had something else happened? The crowd began to disperse, the tension slowly lifting, but the young man remained where he was, his feet rooted to the ground. He watched as the guards resumed their positions, their movements still precise, but now with an underlying heaviness to them. The ceremony, which had once felt so perfect and pristine, now felt hollow. It was as if the fall of the rider had shaken the very foundation of the tradition. He shook his head, trying to push the images of the accident out of his mind. But they wouldn't leave. He could still see the way the rider had flown through the air, his body twisting before hitting the ground with a sickening thud. It felt like a nightmare, and yet it had all been so real. The young man swallowed hard, the taste of fear lingering in his throat. After a few moments, he realized he was no longer alone. He turned and saw another spectator standing next to him, a woman who had been watching the ceremony with her children just moments earlier. She was staring at the spot where the rider had fallen, her expression unreadable. "Do you think you'll be okay?" the woman asked quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. The young man wasn't sure how to answer. He didn't want to say the wrong thing, didn't want to give her false hope. I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I hope so. I really hope so." The woman nodded, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They both stood there, staring at the empty space where the accident had occurred, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The young man's mind wandered back to the rider. He could still see his face, pale and unmoving, lying on the cold ground. And then there was the horse, so wild, so unlike any horse he had ever seen before. It had been as if something inside the animal had snapped, causing it to bolt in a panic. For a moment, the young man wondered if there was more to the story than just a simple accident. Had something spooked the horse? Or had there been an underlying issue with the rider? Maybe the young man would never know the answers to these questions. All he could do now was hope, just like everyone else who had witnessed the incident. He could only hope that the rider would wake up, that he would recover, that this would all be nothing more than a bad memory in a few days. But deep down, the young man couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. And no matter how much he hoped, no matter how much he prayed for the rider's safety, the truth remained. He was powerless in this moment. All he could do was watch as the medics rushed the rider away, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty and fear. As the young man turned to leave, he felt a sense of heaviness in his chest. The horse guards parade, once so majestic and full of life, now felt empty, like a place haunted by the events that had just unfolded. He had come here to witness history, but what he had witnessed instead had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. And as he walked away from the parade ground, the only words he could hear in his head were the same ones he had whispered earlier. "I hope he's okay." The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as the young man walked slowly away from the Horse Guards parade. His mind was still racing, his thoughts consumed by the image of the fallen rider. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in his chest. What had happened? Was it a simple accident, or was there something more to it? His feet moved automatically, taking him farther from the scene, but his mind remained stuck in that one moment, the moment when the horse reared up and threw its rider to the ground. He had never seen anything like it. The chaos, the panic in the air, the stillness of the rider afterward, it was all so unsettling. The young man's hands were trembling as he pulled his phone out of his pocket, hoping to get some kind of update, some sign that the rider would be okay. But the phone screen was blank, and the young man knew there was no use in checking the news yet. It was too soon. The media would likely pick up the story later, but for now, there was nothing he could do except wait. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another incident. Something felt different. The rider had been part of the Horse Guards for years. He had always looked so strong, so confident on his horse. Seeing him fall, so helpless, had shaken the young man more than he cared to admit. The streets of London felt quieter as he walked aimlessly through the city. People were going about their business, tourists snapping photos of the nearby landmarks, commuters rushing past him on their way to work. The world continued on, but he felt disconnected, as if he were in a different reality altogether. He wanted answers, but the only thing he could do was replay the accident over and over in his mind. He passed a cafe on his left, and without thinking, he stepped inside. The smell of coffee and baked goods filled the air, and the sound of soft chatter from the customers made him feel momentarily human again. He walked up to the counter and ordered a coffee, his hands still unsteady as he handed the barista his payment. She gave him a warm smile, but he didn't really see her. His mind was still back at Horse Guards parade, still with that rider, still wondering if he would be okay. He took his coffee to a quiet corner of the cafe, sat down, and stared out the window. The bustling city life outside seemed so far removed from what he had just witnessed. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. The rider had been so skilled, so experienced. How could something like this happen to him? And why had the horse reacted the way it did? Was it just a random freak accident, or had there been a deeper issue that no one had seen before? The young man's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone vibrating on the table. He looked down and saw a message notification from one of his friends. It was short, simple. "He's okay. They're taking him to the hospital, but he's awake." A wave of relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by more questions. What did okay mean? Was he injured? How serious was it? The young man's fingers hovered over the screen as he debated whether or not to ask for more details. But before he could type anything, another message came through. "He's hurt, but it's not life-threatening. They're just being cautious." The young man let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Not life-threatening. Those words were a balm to his worried soul, but still, something didn't sit right with him. Why had the horse reacted that way? Was it truly an accident, or had something caused the horse to become so frantic? He sat back in his chair, sipping his coffee, trying to make sense of everything. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there had to be more to the story. Horses didn't just bolt for no reason. They were trained to handle crowds, to stay calm in the most stressful situations. And yet this horse had panicked. Something had triggered that reaction, but what? The young man's mind raced through possibilities. Was the rider's horse always this jumpy? Had there been any warning signs leading up to the incident? He thought back to earlier in the ceremony. Had there been anything out of the ordinary? But he couldn't remember anything specific, nothing that would explain the horse's behavior. It was as if the animal had snapped for no reason at all. His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. This time, it was a news alert. He opened it quickly, hoping for some concrete information. The headline read, "Horse Guard Rider Injured in Freak Accident During Changing of the Guard Ceremony." The article confirmed that the rider had been thrown off his horse and had suffered some injuries, but nothing too serious. He would recover, they said. But the young man couldn't help but feel that there was more to the story. He had been a part of the audience, had witnessed the whole thing firsthand. Something about that moment felt too strange, too out of place for it to be just an accident. The way the horse had reacted was unlike anything he had seen before. And the rider, his stillness, his quiet fall, left an unsettling feeling in the young man's stomach. He had seen other riders fall, but never like this. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something, some crucial detail that would explain it all. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't know enough to figure it out on his own. The truth was, he was just as much in the dark as everyone else. All he knew was that the rider was hurt, but he would survive. For now, that was the best news he could hope for. The young man finished his coffee and left the cafe, still deep in thought. He walked through the busy streets, feeling the weight of the day on his shoulders. The world around him hadn't changed, but he had. He had witnessed something unexpected, something that would stay with him for a long time. And even though the rider was going to be okay, the questions would linger unanswered. As he passed by the horse guards parade again on his way home, he looked over at the spot where the incident had taken place. It was quiet now, the crowd gone, the ceremony over. But the young man couldn't help but feel that something was still there, something that had been left behind, lingering in the air. He took a deep breath and kept walking, his mind still racing with questions. The rider would recover. He would go on to ride again, to stand tall on his horse during the next ceremony. But the young man knew one thing for sure. He would never look at the horse guards parade the same way again. The days that followed felt like they dragged on, each one blending into the next with an unsettling rhythm. The young man found it difficult to shake off the image of the rider lying still on the cobblestones, and no matter how many times he told himself it was over, that the rider was okay, his mind would always return to that moment. It was like a puzzle with a missing piece, one he couldn't find no matter how hard he searched. For the next few days, life continued around him as it always had. He went to work, spent time with his friends, but there was always a part of him that felt disconnected, as though a shadow lingered just behind him, reminding him of the fall at Horse Guards Parade. He had heard that the rider was recovering in the hospital, but the details were scarce. Every time he tried to look up more information, the news articles were vague, offering little more than the fact that the rider would make a full recovery. It didn't feel like enough. He needed to know more. It wasn't that he was obsessed with the incident. It was just that something didn't sit right. He couldn't stop wondering why the horse had reacted the way it had. Horses were trained for these events, for large crowds and loud noises. They were meant to be calm, steady, part of a seamless, centuries-old tradition. Yet this horse, this one animal, had suddenly panicked. It was unlike anything the young man had ever witnessed before. That afternoon, he found himself back at Horse Guards Parade. He hadn't planned to go back, but somehow, his feet had carried him there. The streets were quieter today, the usual hustle of tourists and commuters missing, and the young man found a strange comfort in the emptiness. As he stood near the parade ground, his eyes wandered to the spot where the accident had happened. It was still the same as before, nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. The silence felt heavier now, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The young man stared at the spot for a long while, his mind returning again to the moment when the horse had reared up. It had all happened so fast, too fast for anyone to fully process. But as he stood there, he started to realize something. He hadn't been the only one who had seen it. There had been other people around, other witnesses who might have noticed something he had missed. Perhaps someone else had seen the horse's behavior beforehand, or perhaps someone had been closer to the rider and could shed light on what had really happened. He walked slowly around the parade ground, scanning the area as though he might find some clue, some hidden piece of the puzzle that would explain it all. He passed a small cafe at the corner and paused, noticing a few familiar faces inside. There were a couple of regulars, people who seemed to always be here, enjoying their afternoon tea or chatting about the weather. Among them was a man he recognized, a middle-aged man who always seemed to have a deep interest in the Horse Guards parade, someone who had often watched the ceremony from the same spot as the young man. The man noticed him too and gave him a small wave. The young man walked over, hesitated for a moment, and then took a seat across from him. "Back again?" the man asked, his tone friendly but with a knowing look in his eyes, as if he could sense the young man's lingering thoughts. "Yeah," the young man replied, rubbing the back of his neck. I can't stop thinking about it. The accident, it felt so sudden." The man nodded, his expression turning serious. "I know, I saw it too. It was the way the horse behaved, wasn't it?" "That's what's got you thinking." The young man blinked, surprised that the other man had noticed. "Yeah, you saw it too. That horse. There was something off about it, like it just snapped." The older man leaned forward, his voice lowering as if he were sharing a secret. "I've been watching the guards for years, and I've never seen anything like it either. That horse, it wasn't the usual calm, trained animal you'd expect at these ceremonies. I'm not sure what happened, but it wasn't just a freak accident." The young man's heart raced a little. "What do you mean? You think something caused it?" The man took a deep breath, looking around as if to make sure no one was listening. "I've been here during some of the most tense moments, crowds shouting, fireworks going off, and the horses never flinch. But that one, it looked spooked, and when I saw the way it reacted, it wasn't like any of the others. It wasn't a moment of fear or surprise. It was more like it was trying to escape something inside it." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the young man didn't know how to respond. Could it be? Had something inside the horse caused it to act in such a violent way? Could there have been a deeper issue, something no one else had seen? "What do you think caused it?" the young man asked, his voice barely a whisper. The older man paused for a moment, staring out the window toward the parade ground. "I can't say for sure, but I've seen the guards before, and I've noticed how much stress they're under. The horses are part of the tradition, but there's always a lot of pressure to perform, to get everything right. Maybe it was too much for that horse. Maybe it just couldn't handle it anymore." The young man felt a shiver run down his spine. It made sense in a way. The pressure to perform, the weight of the tradition, the expectations. Perhaps the horse had been pushed to its limit, and in that moment it had reacted in the only way it knew how. But what about the rider? What had he been feeling in that moment? Was he just as overwhelmed? The young man's thoughts swirled with possibilities, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was no easy answer. He would never know the full truth, not unless someone came forward with more information. All he could do was keep searching for clues, keep asking questions. But in the end, the most important thing was that the rider would recover. The incident, as unsettling as it had been, would eventually fade into history. The older man patted him on the shoulder. "I know it's hard," he said gently, "but sometimes things happen that we can't explain. All we can do is hope for the best and move forward." The young man nodded, finally feeling a sense of closure. There were still unanswered questions, but for now, he would have to accept that some things would remain a mystery. He stood up, thanked the man, and left the cafe, stepping back into the world that continued on, oblivious to the turmoil that had gripped him in the days since the accident. As he walked down the street, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the city. It was peaceful now, and the world felt a little more balanced. He would never forget that day, but the tension inside him had eased just a little. Sometimes all you could do was hope for the best, and let time do the rest. It had been a week since the incident, but the young man still found it hard to move on. He tried to distract himself with work, with his usual routines, but his thoughts always seemed to circle back to that day at Horse Guards Parade. The image of the rider lying still on the ground, and the frantic horse that had thrown him seemed to replay in his mind, uninvited and relentless. But today, something felt different. He was beginning to understand that, no matter how many questions lingered, there was no way to rewrite what had happened. The story had already been told, and now it was up to him to let it go. He had received another message from a friend a few days ago, saying the rider was doing better, recovering faster than expected. The doctors had said he would be out of the hospital soon, and though the injuries weren't as serious as initially feared, it was clear that the incident had shaken him. There were rumors that he might not return to his post with the Horse Guards. That decision was still up in the air. The young man found himself wondering how it would feel to be that rider, to be thrown from such a height, to be so vulnerable in front of thousands of people. The thought sent a chill through him. As the week passed, the young man had found comfort in the quiet. The city continued its usual rhythm, the Horse Guards Parade carrying on with its ceremonies, though it felt strangely hollow to him now. The guards still stood tall, the horses still marched, but the spirit of the event seemed dampened by the shadow of the accident. But today, he was determined to find closure. He couldn't keep going over the same moment again and again. He needed to do something, even if it was just stepping away from the past. He decided to visit the Horse Guards Parade once more, perhaps for the last time in a while. He wasn't sure why, but he felt an odd sense of calm as he walked toward the parade ground. This time there was no anxious anticipation in the pit of his stomach, no unease about what might happen next. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance. Whatever had happened, it was over now. All that was left was the aftermath. When he arrived, the usual crowd of tourists had gathered. Some were lining the streets, others snapping photos of the guards, still in their striking red uniforms and gleaming black helmets. The horses, too, were present, looking majestic as ever. But this time, the young man saw them differently. He saw not just the horses and riders performing their duties, but the deep connection between them. These were not just animals and soldiers. They were partners in a centuries-old tradition, each one relying on the other to perform their part. That bond was something special, something that couldn't be seen on the surface, but that made everything work together so perfectly. For a moment the young man stood in silence, watching the guards as they moved through their routine. He felt a kind of peace settle over him, a feeling that was strange but welcome. The worries, the questions, everything he had been carrying for the past week started to fade. It was almost as if the parade itself was giving him permission to let go. As the guards continued their march, the young man felt the weight of the last few days begin to lift. He had thought he needed answers to make sense of what had happened, but now he realized that perhaps the answers didn't matter as much as he had believed. The incident, the fall, the horse, everything that had seemed so important in the immediate aftermath, had now become just one part of the larger picture. Life would go on. The Horse Guards Parade would continue. The rider, though changed by the event, would eventually return, and everything would return to its rhythm, in its own time. Just as he was about to turn and leave, he noticed a figure standing by the side of the parade ground, watching the ceremony with quiet interest. It was the older man he had spoken to in the cafe a few days earlier, The man gave him a small nod, and the young man, drawn by some unspoken understanding, walked over to him. "You're back," the older man said, his voice calm but knowing. "Yeah," the young man replied, glancing over at the guards again. "I needed to come back. I think I'm finally ready to move on from it." The older man smiled, a hint of approval in his eyes. "It's not easy, is it? Something like that stays with you, even when you don't want it to." The young man nodded. "Yeah, it's been hard. I've been thinking about it every day, trying to figure out why it happened, trying to make sense of it." "And did you?" the older man asked, his gaze steady on the young man. The young man hesitated for a moment, his eyes on the ceremony unfolding before them. "I don't think I'll ever know exactly why it happened," he said quietly. "But I think I've learned that sometimes you don't need to know the why. Sometimes you just need to accept that things happen, and the only thing you can control is how you move forward." The older man nodded, as though the young man had said something wise, something important. "It's a hard lesson to learn, but it's the truth. You can't change the past, but you can choose how you let it shape you." The young man looked out at the parade ground once more, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The guards were still marching, their movements flawless and disciplined, their horses steady beneath them. The rhythm of the ceremony had not changed, and yet it felt different to him now. It was no longer just a performance or a tradition. It was a symbol of resilience, of moving forward even when the past tried to hold you back. "Thanks," the young man said, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I think I finally understand what you meant." The older man smiled again, a warm, understanding smile. "You'll be all right. We all will. Life has a way of moving forward whether we're ready or not. And sometimes that's the best thing we can hope for." The young man nodded, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He stood there for a while longer, taking in the scene before him, the quiet beauty of the ceremony, the horses, the guards. The past would always be there, lingering in the background, but he was ready to leave it behind. It was time to let go. As he turned and walked away from the horse guards' parade for the last time, he felt lighter. The questions that had consumed him no longer held power over him. The rider would recover. The horse would be trained again. The ceremony would continue as it always had, and in time, everything would find its place. He took a deep breath and walked into the busy streets of London, ready to embrace whatever came next. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city, and the young man felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in days. Sometimes all you could do was move forward, step by step, and trust that time would bring the healing that was needed.